our armed
But she was
forces.
wrong, wasn't she? Because British F-35s and Typhoon jets have been in action, shooting down Iranian missiles in recent days. That's not just hanging around. Will she apologise?
Well, she was criticising the Labour government for the way they've deployed our armed forces.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Genuinely glad you are here for this one because this video is something else. So what you are about to watch is a live television interview where a British journalist sits down with Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, and what starts as a political discussion about the UK's role in a major international conflict turns into something far more intense than either side probably expected. Chris comes in confident, ready to push his argument, and the interviewer just keeps pulling the thread until the whole thing starts unraveling in real time. Stick with this one all the way through because the ending is the part that genuinely caught me off guard, and I think it will catch you off guard too. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from. I always love seeing how far this channel reaches, and honestly it makes the conversation in the comments so much better. Alright, let's get into it.
Everyone would agree, certainly you and I sat here, the Iranian regime, bloody, barbarous, appalling regime, no friends of ours, right? But we know we've played this game before. We've played it in Libya. We've played it in Iraq. We've played it in Afghanistan. We get rid of a regime and we cannot control the consequences. So even if you get what you wish for, which is a replacement regime, who knows what replaces it? And who knows what instability is caused? And economic damage comes and refugees flow. You can't know the consequences. Why do we keep playing this game and expect different results?
Well, I think one of the reasons why we might have wanted to be more cooperative with the military action being taken is it would have given us an ability to understand what the plan was and perhaps even to influence it. So you're right to say that in those other examples, Iraq, Libya, Syria, even Egypt as well. Well, that was internal rather than external. But in those other examples, when the regime fell, you're right to say it doesn't necessarily follow that something better replaces it. So you do need some kind of proper plan. But on the outside,
that's how we got ISIS.
But as a result of Iraq, but the fact that we're not even really being consulted by the US means we have no influence over whatever their plan may be. We're simply.
Would we have any influence anyway?
Well, the UK is simply. We certainly have no influence now. The UK is spectators. We don't.
Well, maybe that's good. Maybe we should be spectators. Maybe we shouldn't be getting involved at something that could be illegal, that could create massive refugee flows. It is already causing people who are listening to this, probably going to cost them money in terms of their energy bills. Who knows, maybe even gas supply shortages. Maybe we should keep out of it.
Look, I think there comes a point when a rogue state's actions become so egregious, and I would say, personally, I would say slaughtering 35,000 civilians crosses that threshold where you have to take action. And you know what? You don't get certainty in these situations. Yes, you've got to think carefully. Yes, there should be a plan, and I don't know if the Americans have one or not. I'm not privy to that information. They may have a plan or they may not. I've honestly got no idea. But there comes a point when the actions of a rogue state become so bad.
So we just support the Americans no matter what?
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I think we need to be clear about why we'd be involved, stopping the civilian slaughter, stopping the nuclear program, stopping Iran-sponsored terrorism. But if we were involved, we should also be talking to the Americans about what their plan is and about how a transition could be made. But we're not even at the table.
But Keir Starmer made clear that when he was consulted about it, he was not satisfied that there was a plan. And that's why we're not involved. He's doing and done precisely what you're suggesting, which is to try and find out what the plan is. And if there isn't one, you can understand why you wouldn't back it.
No, the reason Keir Starmer, the UK, are not involved in this is because Keir Starmer is more interested in the expansive interpretation of international law that Lord Hermer gives him than about confronting the Iranian regime. He is terrified.
Maybe he's listening to the public.
This is the moment that stopped me cold, because the interviewer didn't just push back. He laid out one of the most honest observations you will hear in modern political debate. And what makes it hit so hard is that Chris Philp, the guest, couldn't actually deny it. You have to understand what is being said here. The interviewer is pointing to a pattern, not a theory. A pattern. Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. 3 separate situations. 3 separate justifications. 3 separate promises that removing a brutal regime would make things better. And every single time, the chaos that followed was worse than what came before. That is not opinion. That is documented, recorded, lived history. And here is what blows my mind. The interviewer said this directly. The Iranian regime, bloody, barbarous, appalling, no friends of ours. And he is not defending the regime. He is not saying do nothing forever. He is asking a question that nobody on the pro-war side ever wants to seriously answer, which is, what happens the morning after? Because that question is everything. Think about what happened after the fall of certain Middle Eastern governments in the 2000s. The power vacuum that was created didn't just cause instability, it created the conditions for extremist groups to recruit, to arm, and to expand across entire regions. Chris Philp himself actually admitted this. He said it right there. That's how we got ISIS. He said it himself. That is not the interviewer putting words in his mouth. That is the guest conceding that regime change without a plan produced one of the most dangerous armed groups the modern world has seen. And then, after admitting that, he still argued for involvement. Let that sit for a second. He acknowledged the lesson, he named the consequence, and then continued pushing the same logic anyway. That is the part that tells you everything about how this argument is being made. It is being made on emotion and moral outrage, which I understand. But emotion without a plan is not a strategy. It is a feeling dressed up as foreign policy. What the interviewer is doing here is something that gets lost in these debates. He is separating two things that people constantly collapse together. Condemning a regime and supporting military action against it are not the same decision. You can believe a government is terrible and believe that bombing it without a clear transition plan will make ordinary people's lives worse. Those two positions can exist at the same time.
Terrified of his own left wing. He was speaking at an iftar dinner the other day, boasting that Britain wasn't involved. I mean, don't know why he was boasting about that. And
Well, maybe because he thinks it's a bad idea, and maybe because the British public back him on it. Look at all the polling. The British public disagree with you, and they agree with Keir Starmer. They do not want us to get involved.
well, look, I think letting a brutal regime murder its own citizens is simply not the right thing to do, particularly where that regime is also trying to get hold of nuclear weapons, also sponsors terrorism. And by the way, look, even whatever your views are on this particular point, there is another point, which is the government have been in complete dereliction of duty by not moving British military ships into the region in advance to protect Cyprus, to protect the Gulf states. Now, because Keir Starmer was asked about this by the Americans 3 or 4 weeks ago, when they asked if they could use the Diego Garcia military base and RAF Fairford. They asked the question 3 or 4 weeks ago. So Starmer knew this was coming, and he did not move British warships like the aircraft carrier, the Prince of Wales, or the destroyer
There are lots
HMS
of
Dragon.
countries with human rights transgressions, Chris Philp.
He didn't move those ships into the region, and he has left. Keir Starmer and Labour have left Cyprus undefended. They've left our Gulf allies like the UAE, Oman, Qatar, those sort of countries completely
Well, there's your party
undefended
who hollowed out
as
their
well.
armed forces. As
Well, hang on a sec. Those ships exist. They're sitting in Portsmouth right as we speak. Sitting in
And if we
Portsmouth.
had more ships, then maybe we would have been in a
doing
different
nothing.
position.
They could quite easily have moved those ships 3 weeks ago, and they failed to do so, leaving Cyprus undefended. And that is a shameful dereliction of
Conservative
duty.
Party constantly bangs on about sovereignty. Here's the Prime Minister exercising sovereignty, and you're livid.
Well, he has failed to stand up to a rogue terrorist state, and he has failed to move our assets that we have. They're sitting in Portsmouth as we speak. He's failed to move our assets into position in advance. Even if you buy this Keir Starmer line about defensive operations only, you need to have the assets in theatre to provide the defence. He could have moved them 3 weeks ago, but he chose not to, leaving Cyprus and RAF Akrotiri, our base on Cyprus, completely undefended.
Your leader says Labour is nothing like the patriotic party of yesteryear. Are you really saying that Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper and David Lammy and the rest of them aren't patriotic?
Well, I would agree with that, because they have failed
They're
to
not
take
patriotic.
They've failed to take basic action to defend things like our sovereign base in
Pretty
Cyprus.
low blow to say they're not patriotic. You might disagree with them, but are we really saying they're not patriots?
Well, they failed to take basic steps,
That's
obvious common
different from
sense
being
steps.
patriotic, isn't it?
Well,
you could be an incompetent patriot. We could argue we've probably had plenty of those over the years.
All right. Well, look, I'll concede this. They could either be unpatriotic or they could be incompetent, maybe even both.
Here is the context you need. The guest has been going hard, criticizing Keir Starmer, criticizing the decision not to move British warships into the region, calling it a dereliction of duty, framing it as weakness. And then the interviewer says, your party constantly talks about sovereignty, and here is the Prime Minister actually exercising it, and you are furious about it. That is not just a good point. That is the kind of point that exposes a contradiction so cleanly that there is nowhere to go, because the conservative argument for years has been built around the idea of national sovereignty, taking back control. making British decisions for British interests. And the moment a Labour Prime Minister says, "We are not joining this conflict because we are not satisfied there is a plan," suddenly sovereignty is a problem. The guest's response was to pivot immediately to Cyprus and warships and Diego Garcia, which tells you he felt that hit. When someone avoids the direct question and jumps to a different criticism, that is not confidence. That is redirection. And then the interviewer did something even sharper. He brought in public polling. The British public disagree with you, and they agree with Keir Starmer. They do not want us to get involved. Now, I know some people will say polling isn't everything, and that is fair. But in a democracy, when the leader of the opposition is calling the Prime Minister a coward for a decision that the majority of the public actually support, that is a significant problem for your argument. Here is what people do not realize about this kind of political moment. The guest kept framing Starmer's decision as fear. Now, fear of the left wing, fear of his own party, but fear and caution are not the same thing. Leaders who rushed into conflicts without public support and without clear objectives have a very specific historical track record, and it is not a good one. Caution, consultation, asking for a plan before committing forces, those are not signs of weakness. Historically, those are exactly the questions that should have been asked before decisions that cost thousands of lives were made.
But they're not saying they're not patriotic.
The Labour Party is not certainly one of the two.
They're saying the Labour Party is not patriotic. I mean, they could turn around to you and say, well, you let our armed forces sort of run down over the years, so you're not patriotic.
Well, I don't agree with that. We've got two aircraft. We're the only European power, major European power, to have two.
And we had no planes on them for years.
And they're fully equipped with F-35Bs, the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. But instead of being deployed in the theatre, protecting Cyprus and protecting Gulf states from the Iranian attack. And by the way, Iran is now attacking all kinds of other countries as well. Indeed. Instead of being deployed there, protecting the Gulf, which is obviously a critical oil route, or protecting our base on Cyprus, they're tied up in Portsmouth.
Will Kemi Badenoch apologise to the armed forces for saying that our jets are just hanging around?
Well, the criticism Kemi levelled wasn't at the aircrew or at the officers commanding the RAF.
Understand they may have taken it that way.
Well, to be clear, her remarks weren't directed at the service personnel. They were directed at the Labour government, who obviously control how they're deployed. And she was commenting
on... But they weren't just hanging around, are they?
She was commenting on Labour's failure to properly deploy our armed forces.
But she was wrong, wasn't she? Because British F-35s and Typhoon jets have been in action, shooting down Iranian missiles in recent days. That's not just hanging around. Will she apologise?
Well, she was criticising the Labour government for the way they've deployed our armed forces.
She said they were just hanging around.
Which includes not participating in strikes into Iran to degrade not just the missiles coming over.
She criticised them incorrectly.
But to also target, what they're not doing, because the Labour government have told them not to, is target Iranian military bases.
Would you accept they're not just hanging around?
Soil. Well, I'm afraid the way that Labour have chosen to deploy our armed forces does not include...
They've been in action.
...taking critical, to some extent, but they haven't been involved in taking out the source of the problem on Iranian soil.
Can you understand if you were one of those fighter pilots hearing His Majesty's loyal leader of the opposition suggest they've been hanging around while they've been in action, could be very offensive.
I think it's clear to everybody, including service personnel, that Kemi's remarks related to decisions taken by the Labour government.
But she said they were just hanging around and they've been in action. Yeah. That's wrong, right? That is just factually wrong. Will she apologise for being factually wrong?
Look, as I said, the action has not included some of the things it should have done, like striking targets in Iran.
Oh, this is where it completely unravels for the guest, and I cannot look away. The interviewer just dropped something that is impossible to walk back from. He pointed out that British F-35s and Typhoon jets had already been in active combat, shooting down missiles in real time. And the leader of the opposition had described them as just hanging around. The interviewer asked directly, "Will she apologize?" And Chris Philp could not say yes. He tried to reframe it. He said she was criticizing the Labour government's deployment decisions, not the pilots themselves. But here's the problem with that. She said the jets were just hanging around. That is a factual claim about activity, and it was factually wrong. Those jets were in action. That is not interpretation. That is not spin. Well, that is a verifiable fact that directly contradicts what was said publicly by the opposition leader. What you are watching here is the guest being asked the same question multiple times and finding a different way to not answer it every single time. Will she apologize? No direct answer. Will she apologize for being factually wrong? Still no direct answer. And the interviewer called it exactly what it was. That is just factually wrong. Here is what this moment actually reveals. When a political figure makes a factual error in public, not a matter of opinion, not a policy disagreement, but a claim about something that either happened or did not happen, the response to that matters enormously. Because if you cannot say, yes, she got that wrong and she should correct it, then you are not defending a position. You are protecting a brand. And audiences, whether they admit it or not, can feel that difference immediately. The guest came into this interview with sharp criticisms, confident framing, and a lot of energy. And he left this final section unable to answer a simple yes or no question 3 times in a row. That is the part that stays with you. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.